My name's Julie Bergen. My company is OCD Strings, and I have been shooting Olympic recurve since 10 mumble years. When did I start, Steve? I don't even know. It's been a while, but I have primarily been shooting Olympic recurve. I build strings for Olympic recurve because I build for what I know. I also build for a lot of barebow shooters. I set up OCD Strings in 2019, and I have built thousands of strings at this point. And with every string, I collect a lot of data. I have measurements. I know a lot ends up on the package for the string if you order a string, but there's a lot more that doesn't even fit on the label that I keep track of to be able to predict and more precisely build future strings. And I do a lot of experimenting too. So that's a little background, but today we're talking about string materials and what is the difference between all these materials. So here's a bunch of materials. It's like, okay, this is what I have available to me. How do I know what is best for me? How do I know what the differences are? And how do I narrow this down and make sure I am shooting the best material for what I'm trying to do? And so with 22 options, that's a lot. And we need to figure out how to better navigate this. So I've compiled a bunch of data and have some ideas. I know a lot of people start with information from the internet, and you never quite know what you're going to get with internet information. You don't know the experience of those people. Sometimes they don't even use their real names when they're contributing to these forums. And so it can be a reliable source, but it can also be, somebody's opinion, and you don't know if you can trust it. So let's start off by looking at the string manufacturers. There are 4 main manufacturers that we have available to us. We have BCY, Bloodline, Angel, and Brownell. Now, in the US, it is getting almost impossible to get Angel materials, and Brownell has been pretty much impossible to purchase for quite some time. So we're going to eliminate those as possibilities, just because if we fall in love with one of these materials, if we can somehow get it, you can't continue to use it. The string is a consumable item, and if you wear out a string and you can't make another one, you're going to have to switch materials anyway. So we're going to eliminate those, and we are going to look more closely at the BCY and the Bloodline options. So that narrows it down from 22 to about 14, which is great. So then how do we narrow it down from there? So we are talking specifically about materials that are appropriate for recurve bows. Let's take a closer look at what the materials actually look like. So this is a single strand of a material, but if you take the end and you pry it apart, you see that it's made up of individual fibers within that single strand, and your entire string is made up of a certain number of strands. And so each of those, it can be a different material. And string material itself is not round, so we can't measure a diameter because it's kind of like the tape dental floss. It is a flattened material, and so we can't really rely on measuring it with a diameter. So there is a measurement used in fibers called a denier, and that is not a perfect measurement, but it does give us kind of a relationship between certain materials. And this is some information that you can get from the string manufacturers themselves. So if you look at this continuum, you see that we have mercury on one end, which is an 800 denier. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have B55, which is a 2600. And so we can see that there are different sizes of each of these materials. And so when you ask an archer what they're shooting and they say 16 strands, it's like, okay, great. 16 strands of what? Because 16 strands of mercury is vastly different than 16 strands of B55. So if we look at the actual materials themselves, this example is 12 strands. So 12 strands of mercury is pretty small, and 12 strands of B55 is much larger. So I just want people to understand that there is a difference between this, and it is worth mentioning when we're discussing what we're building and what we're shooting. All right, string materials. These are the three base string materials that are out there. And you don't really need to know these things, but they all come from one of these three. They have names that you are probably more familiar with. So on the left, we have PET, which is essentially Dacron. It's polyester. That's what a lot of beginner bows strings are made of. We have the HMPE, which is the high modulus polyethylene, which is Spectra and Dyneema, which you've probably heard of, or maybe. And then on the other end, we have this liquid polymer, or liquid crystal polymer, which is Vectran, which is typically used in compound materials. Oh yeah, sure, go for it. Yeah. All right, and beyond that, there are different grades of some of these materials. So let's say Dyneema, there's SK75, SK78, there's SK90, which is no longer produced, and there's SK99. And so each of these are going to react differently to how the bow shoots. And so we need to understand that there's those differences, but that center HMPE is mostly what we use for recurve bows. We're going to eliminate the Vectran from what we should be considering for a recurve bow, just because it is designed for compound. It is going to put a lot of stress into the bow itself when it's shot, because it doesn't absorb, it doesn't have elasticity. It's a pretty stiff material. So that leaves us with the Dacron and the HMPE as options for recurve bows. Like I said, we want some stretch in the material, because we don't want all the force from the shot to go into the limbs. We want the string material to absorb some of that. And you might have noticed that when you get a string that's really old and really worn out, it feels stiffer. And as soon as you get a new string on there with a little bit more stretch, it feels a little softer when you shoot it. Yeah. I mean, there are some people who do that, and most bow manufacturers will say that that'll void your warranty, that it can cause damage to the bow. And if your only concern is arrow speed and you don't care if the bow blows up on you, sure, shoot it. But there might be consequences. Yeah. All right, so that narrows it down to, sorry, where were we? 10 options. All right, if we look at the materials themselves, I dug into the fiber specs from a lot of these, and let me tell you, that is some dry reading. But I've kind of organized them from, on the top we have rubber, which is obviously very, very stretchy, and at the bottom we have steel. And this is how these materials kind of stack up against each other. So we know that Dacron is going to be way stretchier than the SK99. All right, so here we have this continuum from left to right. We have most stretch and least stretch. And on the left, obviously, we have this Dacron that is super stretchy. I don't know if any of you have ever built a Dacron string, but it's like building with rubber bands. It is not a precise thing. And then on the far right side, we have SK99, which is very, very stiff. And a lot of compound shooters are shooting SK99 because it almost doesn't stretch. So here are the materials that fall into those categories that you may have seen. So B55, or the original Branall B50, is that Dacron on the left. And it has its place. There are good uses for it. Vintage bows that can't absorb a lot of that vibration. Steve, I know you have a collection of these. Dacron is great for that. It's good for bows that don't have reinforced limb tips. So they need a little more TLC, so to speak. Traditional long bows, and then a lot of beginner bows end up with Dacron strings just because it is incredibly cheap. So a lot of beginners end up with that. But if you're looking for performance on a recurve, it's maybe not the best thing. So we're going to eliminate that. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, we have the SK99, which is a great material, but it is very, very stiff. And like I said, some compounders are even shooting it. I know there's a lot of compounders who switched over to mercury. And so, like I said, some manufacturers will say that it voids your warranty if you're shooting that material. So for the safety of ourselves and our bows, maybe we should eliminate that as a possibility. So that leaves us 5 options, and that's a little bit more doable. Now, if we take a look at how these SK75 materials stack up. There are 2 that are from BCY, and there's 2 from Bloodline. And they're different sizes. 8125 and D97 are the same fiber. Glory Pro and Loyal are the same fiber from the same manufacturer. The difference is the size of the material. And like I said, we can't rely on it being a diameter because it's flattened, but a larger size material, when you have a certain number of strands and force it into a round string, is not going to be as smooth and round as if you do it with smaller strands and more of them. And so that's what this shows on the bottom here, that the smaller strands are going to lend themselves to a rounder finished string. And I prefer that. And so for that reason, I usually do not use D97 or Loyal. So that leaves us with 3, and that is a very manageable number to figure out how we want to manage what we're going to be doing here. So we have Spectra 652. This is the same material as the original Brownell Fast Flight material. It has a little bit softer feel. It has slightly less speed than the other 2 options, and it is a waxed material. A lot of the Koreans are shooting this, or at least they were, last I heard. And at this point, we're down to personal preference. All of these are excellent options for a recurve. The 8125 has a little bit snappier feel. It has slightly more aero speed. It's equivalent to the original Brownell Fast Flight Plus, and it is also a wax material. And then we have the Glory Pro on the right, which is kind of a hybrid between the 2 in terms of how it feels to shoot. I feel like it feels a little bit softer on the draw, so it feels a little bit more like Spectra to me, but it has the same aero speed as the 8125, so it's kind of like the best of both worlds, in my opinion. It has a proprietary coating on it, so it does not require wax and actually shouldn't be waxed. The manufacturer says that they don't recommend waxing it because the wax can attract dirt particles that can cause more abrasion and cause it to break down faster. So if you have a fuzzy 8125 or 652, waxing it can help protect it longer. But with the Glory Pro, it gets all fuzzy after a while. It's still going to happen. It's still the same fiber. It's going to wear. But when it gets fuzzy, it's just well loved, and maybe it's time to think about a new one sometime soon. Yep. Sorry, I think these slides are in the wrong order. This is a chart that I put together a while back, and it has continued to evolve as I get more information and more data from some of these manufacturers. But this is the most updated, and what this includes is some of the fibers that I haven't talked about. It includes the Angel ones, which are Isanus fibers from the manufacturer, and how they relate to each other in terms of stiffness. So it's the same continuum. So the left is the most stretchy, and on the right is the stiffest material. And I've kind of organized them into buckets for what they're appropriate for. So on the left side is the traditional and vintage bows. The center is the Olympic recurve and bare bow, and on the right is the compound. So I don't recommend using any of the materials on the right on recurves unless you are well aware that you're trading off aero speed for potential damage to your bow. But here's how they stack up against each other. Now, in the past, Brownell has been pretty much impossible to get, and they seem to be making a comeback. They have a booth here, and I've been talking to them about some of their new materials, and I haven't gotten a chance to try them yet, but they're going to be bringing me some samples to test out. So they might have some viable options in the future that we actually have access to. So that could be interesting for having some more options. This is not published on my website just yet. It will be as soon as I verify some of this information, but this is how they stack up. So I do a lot of testing, and so here are some of the tests that I'm planning on doing in the future or have in progress. I'm always working on testing new things. So here's some of what is coming, and all of the stuff I test I put on my blog, so it's all on the website and searchable if you're interested, and or if you have suggestions for what you want to see tested, I can do that too. So anyway, if you want more information, there's lots of stuff on my blog. I also have a knot guide because not all knots are the same, and I have collected about 90 different sample knocks with measurements and everything. So anyway, if you want more information, you can go to the website. You can come to my booth, 607, not that they're numbered, but it's OCD strings, and we're partnering with Baker Archery Products. So does anybody have questions?
With the new string, how many arrows you recommend to shoot?
Oh, to break it in?
Yeah.
I pre-stretch all my strings, so they are pre-stretched for 200 pounds at 200 pounds for 8 hours, and that's what I do for recurve materials. I know compounds do something different, but if it's pre-stretched, 200 arrows should get you to a stable brace height. The string material actually has memory to it. And so if I make 2 identical strings right now and you take those home, and one you put on your bow and the other you put in a drawer to save for later, if you pull out that other string 6 months from now, it has memory and it kind of shrinks back a little bit. So it's going to take a little bit longer to break in, even if it has been pre-stretched.
Then, how many twists of the string do you recommend for the recurve bow?
It's a wide range. For when I initially build a string, I put in half the twists of the bow length in inches. So if you have a 70-inch bow that I'm making a string for, I will start with it having 35 twists. And that's a good, happy starting point, and you can add and remove from there. I wouldn't recommend having any fewer than like 10 or 12 twists. I know people are trying to get different brace heights, and so they remove twists and remove twists. And actually, the first 10 twists don't change the length, really. So there's no point in having any fewer than that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Steve?
More strands is slower arrow speed?
You said more strands is slower. I'm going to reframe that slightly. Sorry. So a smaller finished diameter of the string is going to produce more arrow speed than a larger finished diameter, but the number of strands depends on the material. So for the most part, I have a recommendation on my website for how many strands are appropriate based on the poundage that you're shooting, and that is really just a starting point recommendation. That is not set in stone. That doesn't mean that you have to stick with that. I know Christian doesn't. I think one of your first strings I made you was like 12 strands, and you were shooting what poundage? 40 something pounds. Yeah. The material is plenty strong, but you were looking for more arrow speed, right? Yeah. Okay. So yes, the size of the finished string affects things, but also the number of strands depends on the material. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Yeah. The minimum amount of strands? I mean, I would build you 12 if you wanted. It's the same size as 8125. 16 strands for Spectra is pretty normal. Yeah. Yeah, the more weight you're shooting, you should eventually creep up in strands. But I have archers who like, oh, I turned down my limb bolts a quarter of a turn. Do I need a new string? Usually no. Anything else?
Do we have general guidelines on how frequently to replace the string?
It really depends on how much you're shooting and how well you tolerate a worn out string. So for Gabby Sasai, I've been making her strings for ages, and she is shooting about 1,000 arrows a week, and she goes through about 8 strings a year. But I mean, if you're shooting once a week, and you know, a string could last you a couple of years. It depends. The other thing is that the strings have elasticity and stretch, and over time, as you use the string, it loses some of that, and it feels a little bit more dead. And it happens gradually, and you don't notice it. And usually what happens, I talk about it in relation to sneakers. When you buy new sneakers, they're soft and squishy and comfortable, and they feel great. And over time, that compresses down, and they're not as squishy and comfortable anymore, but you don't notice until you get a new pair. And they're like, oh, that's more comfortable. That's how they're supposed to be. And it's the same with strings. It'll feel a little bit more dead, and then you finally get a new string on there. You're like, oh yeah, that's right. That's how it's supposed to feel. Yeah. Why do you have to wax it? You have to wax it because it is a wax material. You don't have to wax your string. I personally don't wax my strings, but I experiment so much and change my strings so often that it's not usually a problem. But this adding wax is going to add weight to your string, and it is going to slow it down. So the purpose of the wax is to protect the material. And once the fibers start to break apart, nothing's going to reconnect them, but adding that wax is just going to tack them down so that it doesn't look fuzzy, and it's going to help protect it a little bit longer. But once those fibers start to break down, it's probably time to think about a new string.
Do you have an opinion on that Glory Pro proprietary coating?
There's a few proprietary coatings out there. There's the Angel has some kind of coating on it as well that is not wax. It feels very different than the Bloodline coating. The Bloodline coating is very, very slick. The Angel coating is grabbier, if that's a word.
Do you shoot those, or do you shoot ones that are required?
I am currently shooting well, a number of test strings, but I like the feel of the Glory Pro the best. But you know, I'm excited to try some of the Bloodline stuff, or the new Brownell stuff too. Steve.
Some servings, if you want to talk about servings for a minute.
Sure.
Some servings come off my tab easier than others.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. So you're asking about the grippiness or the slickness of servings?
Yes.
Okay. So yes, center serving, I'm assuming is what you're talking about. And yes, there are serving materials that will come off the tab a little bit cleaner, and some that grip a little bit more, and they all have their uses. If you're shooting Olympic recurve, you've got, you know, your finger above and below the knock, your knock set there. You're very unlikely to slip around, and so a slipperier material is going to come off the tab cleaner. So I prefer the Angel Majesty, which is getting very, very hard to find. I think that's the best material out there for center serving for Olympic recurve, hands down. I have not found anything like it. And so when I'm at these things and I go up to the Bloodline guys, I'm like, here, this is what I want. Find a way to build it. So if you guys want to second that opinion and go talk to him, I'd appreciate it. But yeah, the slicker the material, the better. The second choice is going to be Halo for Olympic recurve, because that is the closest to Angel. It's not the same, but that's what we have more readily available to us. Now, for the grippier materials, those are absolutely better for barebow shooters who are string walking, because they don't have that fixed location and they're counting, you know, marks in their tab or strands of serving or whatever they're counting. They're coming down, and once they set that crawl, they don't want that moving. And so a grippier material, or a material that has resin in it, is going to be better for them, because then that's not going to slide around once they set it. Does that answer you? Yeah? Great.
Any thoughts on you know, how they put dyes in colored strings, and as you use the string, that dye comes off?
Yes. And what is your question about that?
Do you have any comments on that?
Well, I mean, yeah, there are string materials that tend to lose their coloring as they are used, and that's in the manufacture of the string material. I think that would be a great question for some of the fiber manufacturers that are here. Yeah, but yeah, there are certain colors that tend to come off. I know the Bloodline unicorn blood color tends to end up everywhere.
I'm just curious, like as the dyes wear off, the string diameter a little bit smaller and stuff.
I know some of the BCY materials, the brighter colors, like the fluorescent colors, tend to be a whiter finished string than some of their darker color equivalents. And they've always said that that's the wax content, and I'm not sure if that's true, but you can get some of that wax out. So, I mean, there is the potential for more variation as the string wears. Yeah, that's fair. Usually, yeah, for end serving, I prefer the smaller materials just because they tend to conform to curves nicer. I personally prefer the twisted materials to the braided ones just because they also tend to conform better. The braided materials are going to be more durable, but also potentially a little louder. Anybody else have anything? All right, if you think of more questions, I'll be at my booth the whole time, so come visit.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.